Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tuckahoe's very first Historic Preservation Commission meeting. It is a momentous event, and we have important things to discuss. So I would like to hereby officially call to order our March 10th, 2022 meeting. For our first order of business, if I could ask everyone to please stand and join us in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Excellent, thank you. We'd like to introduce ourselves as the very first Historic Preservation Commission members. I am Jenny Steinhagen, and it is an absolute honor and privilege for me to be serving as the chair of this commission, and I am joined by two incredibly qualified and competent individuals who I will ask to please state their names as our roll call, and I will look to my right.
Ladislav Castellanos.
Josh Gaccione.
It has been a journey to get to tonight, and we are absolutely committed to do everything we can to enact the principles in the historic preservation legislation that momentously was passed in Tuckahoe on January 10th of 2022, and that is the guide for this commission and all of our activities. And because this commission is new, we have an amazing opportunity to shed some light on what this new legislation is, what this commission is, what we do, and how we do it. So this evening, there are two items of business. The first is a presentation on what the commission is and what it does and the legislation. The second is a proposed acceptance of a landmark application and setting a date for a proposed comprehensive review and potential recommendation to the Board of Trustees for the very first nomination that the Historic Preservation Commission has received. So to begin with the presentation, that will take us through a little bit what the legislation is and the commission, I'd like to recognize that historic preservation legislation, it has some high-level definitions within it, right? But when you break it down, which we will do a little bit tonight, you're actually getting to the nuts and bolts, and I do mean that literally, of place. Because when you think about place, and let's think about Tuckahoe in particular, if I were to ask you, what do you think of when you think of Tuckahoe? Perhaps you envision Depot Square, or the Crestwood train station, maybe the sites of the marble quarries or the Ward House. All of these exist in Tuckahoe currently, but what is to say they will be here for the next generation? Now, this is a question not unique to Tuckahoe. This is a question that has been raised at the federal level and the state level, which is why when we're talking about historic preservation legislation and this sense of place, we are talking about joining the precedent that has been set at the federal, state, and local levels. So when I talk about this high-level justification, it is because there is this long path before us that has set the way for us to move forward. And we do so now because in years of recent past, we've seen in Tuckahoe that some buildings have disappeared, and a lot of people have raised concerns, and these concerns were heard by the village administration, which is why in May of 2021, so last year on that first slide there, in May of 2021, Mary Ann and the Board of Trustees, they created a historic preservation task force. And that task force included the three members up here tonight, as well as Elaine Provenzano and Richard Forliano, the Eastchester town historian. And the Historic Preservation Task Force was put to work with two main tasks. The first was to look into historic preservation legislation, what was out there, and to potentially draft historic preservation legislation specifically for Tuckahoe. In addition, we were to look at what sites may merit landmarking status within Tuckahoe. And boy, did we get moving on that. We were fortunate in that the State Historic Preservation Office offers incredible guidance, including a template for historic preservation legislation. But we quickly learned, too, that historic preservation is not new in Westchester. In fact, 22 of Westchester's 43 municipalities already had existing historic preservation legislation. So we could take the template that was provided by the state that had been in use for decades and look at what White Plains did, what Dobbs Ferry did, and Scarsdale, who does something a little bit different. We were able to take the best pieces of those legislations for historic preservation and build it into ours. We also were working at a swift pace, and in August, were able to present a draft to the Board of Trustees for their review. That same month, the Board of Trustees, they passed a historic buildings moratorium for Tuckahoe, which recognized that specific sites in Tuckahoe had been important in the comprehensive master plan going back many, many years. The public comment period was opened for the legislation. It was open for a number of months, which ultimately brought us to the vote that took place in January of 2022 on January 10th, and it was a unanimous vote by the Board of Trustees to approve the legislation. Now, I mentioned that it had some high-level weight to it. It's because the whole purpose of legislation is not to keep old buildings from being torn down. Rather, it is to recognize that historic districts and landmarks are necessary to promote the cultural, economic, and general welfare of the public. That is explicitly included in the legislation. That is why this legislation exists. And the purpose within this legislation is to take that, foster public knowledge and civic pride, recognize the historic, cultural, and architectural heritage of the village, stimulating the local economy, which there is much research showing that has been proven. And I'll point out one of the other items, conserving valuable material and energy resources, because historic preservation is preserving existing resources and materials. The legislation, and there is a link there that you can see to the legislation, it is posted on Tuckahoe.com under the Historic Preservation Commission's page. It is the guide, so anything I say tonight that can be reinforced by that legislation. So everyone is invited to consult that. In the legislation, you'll see in Section 4, it creates us, the commission. And we have a lot of duties that are included in the legislation, but there are three main ones. We are looking at landmark nominations. We are creating a map of landmarks and historic districts, and we are reviewing certificates of appropriateness. Other things too, and I pointed out here the adoption of financial incentives to owners of historic buildings, because this is absolutely a community effort, and this is one that is meant to be win-win whenever possible. The commission is also able to apply for grants to assist in our activities and the activities of participants in historic preservation in Tuckahoe. So I said that we have those three main tasks as a commission. The first one, and perhaps the most important, is the landmarking of sites within Tuckahoe. There are 7 criteria in Section 5G in the historic preservation legislation that clearly state what justifies a particular building's ability to be landmarked. So whenever a nomination comes before the Historic Preservation Commission, or whenever anyone is thinking about a particular building and whether or not it should be landmarked, this is the section you go to see which of the criteria are met by a particular building. So we will be evaluating nominations based on the criteria in Section 5. And if a site or structure, a building, were to make it all the way through the landmarking process, I'd like to recognize that that is for the exterior of the building. If we do in Tuckahoe have the ability to do interior landmarking in addition to the exterior, but those conditions are quite strict because the building, in order to have an interior landmarking, needs to be open to the public or have an interior into which the public is customarily invited. We also have in Tuckahoe's historic preservation legislation the ability to recognize historic districts as well as scenic landmarks, which are explained in great depth in the legislation. So the landmarking process, you could see it here in 5 easy steps. Everything starts with the submission of a landmarking nomination form that is posted on the Tuckahoe.com website. That form gets filled out either by or presented to the Historic Preservation Commission. And that really starts the ball rolling. The commission then is tasked with a review of that early submission. And the commission can decide based on the information provided in the nomination form. So essentially the criteria, have those criteria been met? The commission can decide whether or not it will accept the nomination form. If a vote is taken to accept a nomination form, then the Historic Preservation Commission will set a public meeting. And it is during that public meeting into which all interested parties are invited to attend and information is presented. Members of the public are encouraged and invited to provide additional input. All of it is the gathering of facts to aid the commission in ultimately reaching a decision on whether or not the nominated site or structure or property will make it to the next phase, which involves the commission recommending to the Board of Trustees that the Board of Trustees open up a public hearing and ultimately take a vote on whether or not to landmark a site or structure. So that's the process in a nutshell. You'll see real quick in the small font there are, if you scroll up just a tiny bit, yes. So you'll see there is an appeals process, but let us be clear that once a nomination, a legitimate nomination, has been accepted by the commission, work is halted on or discouraged from beginning based on the need to follow the process, which happens after it. Okay. The maps was the next part that the commission is tasked with, keeping maps. I mentioned out of the 3, but then that third is a certificate of appropriateness. So if and when a site or structure is landmarked. So it's gone through the commission's process, and then it goes to the Board of Trustees and goes through their public hearing process, and they take a vote and affirmatively they approve the site in question. Then changes to those buildings need to be reviewed and approved by the Historic Preservation Commission. There's a lot of information in the legislation about what types of changes would prompt the requirement of a certificate of appropriateness. Without getting into too many of them, I'll just mention that in Section 8, it tells you what you don't need to get a certificate of appropriateness for. So if there are any questions about what can or cannot be done to a landmarked building, it's clearly spelled out in the legislation. The certificate of appropriateness follows a similar process in the sense that a form must be filled out. That form gets to this commission. The commission reviews it and determines whether or not they agree with it and if the work can be done. The main difference between the certificate of appropriateness process and the local landmarking process is that the certificate of appropriateness stops with the commission. So the decision that the commission makes is the decision that is applicable to the site in question, the landmark. It does not go next to the Board of Trustees. It stops there. And that list, a short jump to the next page, shows you a few of the potential landmarks in Tuckahoe. This is a list that was developed many, many years ago by the Tuckahoe History Committee with input from our friends in Eastchester. This list became part of the official record, if I can call it that, when it was posted on Tuckahoe.com in May of 2021. So there has been a record of the sites that Tuckahoe is considering or would consider as potential landmarks that has been available for almost a year now online. And some good ones there. So this is the process in a nutshell. I think that's where we leave it off. I hope that was helpful as an introduction to what the legislation is and what this commission is here for. The very next item on our agenda is to look at a nomination. It is the proposed acceptance of a landmark application and setting a date for a proposed comprehensive review and potential recommendation to the Village Board of Trustees, because 230 White Plains Road, also known as the Ward House, was the very first landmark nomination submission that this commission received. And tonight, this commission will be taking a vote to move forward in the process. I'd like, though, before we do that, if I could ask Josh, if you could tell us a little bit about that submission.
Certainly, thank you. On February 10th, we received the nomination of historic preservation for 230 White Plains Road, aka the Ward House, from the building department. It contained the necessary signatures from the members of this commission. The application also addressed 6 out of the 7 possible points of criteria for nomination. Of those 6 points, 5 contained substantial support and documentation with primary source material. And we are looking for a vote for a public meeting to discuss this submission.
And we will do that right now. I move that we accept the application for 230 White Plains Road, also known as the Ward House, and that we set a public meeting for April 14th to review the potential recommendation to the Village Board of Trustees. Can I have a second?
Second.
All
in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So that absolutely passes. Thank you for your work on that. I'd now like to open up the meeting for any discussion, if we have any from the members of the public who have joined us tonight.
My name is Sal Provenzano. I live at 11 River Street in Tuckahoe. I am the treasurer of Friends of the Ward House, Inc. And on behalf of our organization, I want to give heartfelt thanks to the commission for approving the application. And I want to also commend you for the yeoman's work that you did to get this legislation through. It must have taken a lot of time and a lot of hours, and it just shows with the way that you presented this legislation. I also want to say that you talk about the application process. All 62 pages of the application, which we we did not take lightly. We are not, we are not out to change, property law and free enterprise and all that. But we do have a passion for the historical integrity of the Ward House, not just the structure itself, but the site itself. And I have to say that in the work that we did just to put together the application was an eye-opener for me personally. I never realized, I lived in Eastchester, I grew up in Eastchester and Tuckahoe and Bronxville. It's funny, I lived in all three towns, and would pass by the Ward House, many, many times, not even thinking twice about it. And when we, got into the woods on this and got into the weeds, and we checked out exactly what it was, we all of the members of Friends of the Ward House were enlightened and learned things. And it's really appropriate if we talk about the timing of tonight and looking forward even to next week. Probably one of the most significant events that happened at the Ward House is going to be commemorated next week on March 16th. And March 16th is the date that Samuel Crawford, who is the most prominent, important patriot to die in the cause of the American Revolution as a patriot. He was mortally wounded there at the Ward House, and there were, a number of others, other patriots that were slain, that day. And it's amazing to me, as important as that date is, that's not the only date with the Ward House. The Ward House history goes back to 1700, when the land was purchased, and in the 1750s when the original house was put together. And it's sad when we see what's going on in Ukraine, but at that time in this town, at that area, the people in this town were experiencing very similar brutality as to the British and the Patriots going back and forth in this no man's land. They called it neutral territory. It wasn't neutral. It was anything but neutral. And on March 16th at 1 p.m., right at the Samuel Crawford Monument across the street from the Ward House, our veterans of foreign wars are going to lay a wreath there, because that is the 245th anniversary date when Samuel Crawford was bayoneted and ultimately died, I think, days later at that point when he was taken into custody. But so many other things happened at that spot. That was the first post office. It was the royal post office at that point. And then it became the post office for 80 years, both under British control and when we became the United States. Martin Van Buren stayed at that house when he toured the marble quarries. I mean, there's just so many things. I can go through 62 pages of things, but I want to just give my thanks to getting this done and to making it on the map. And ultimately, through this process, my goal is to make sure that as many Tuckahoe, Eastchester, and Bronxville residents are educated, just the way I've been educated, in just going through this process of getting this application together. So thank you at the bottom of my heart of getting us to this point. It's exciting, and it's something that we've just begun.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sal.
Thank you, Sal. I would invite you and other interested parties to join our meeting on April 14th, during which we will really get into the heart of the nomination, the 62-pager that you reference. And for everyone's knowledge, that nomination, that application, is posted on the Tuckahoe.com website and is associated with the agenda for tonight's meeting. there any other discussion from the members of the public?
I really wasn't going to speak tonight, but as I've been listening to the news over the last 2 weeks, and I see what's happening in the Ukraine, and I think about the Ward House and the surrounding site, no other area, no other county suffered as long as Westchester. Few places suffered as much. It was called the neutral ground. It was really the contested ground. And when we think about the Declaration of Independence, which was first read on July 11, 1776, Captain Samuel Crawford was on the stage at the courthouse steps in White Plains. And in the Declaration of Independence, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Let's put it in terms of language today. The idea of human rights was born in places like the Ward House. And those of you out there know I've taught thousands of students in Eastchester. And I think our job is not done until everyone knows that the Ward House is of immense importance. When we think of the suffering, the chaos, and the violence of the American Revolution, it was the people who lived here who paid that price so that we can be talking about human rights today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. This is amazing. I'm overcome by the this incredible moment. But I really want to take a moment to thank the mayor who is here tonight, and for the board for approving this, and for everybody who worked on this behind the scenes to get it done, and for your commission. But I especially want to thank Richard Forliano, because none of this could have happened without him. He has been the driving force behind this for several years now, and warning us about we can't lose the Ward House, if anything should happen to the Ward House. So thank you, Richard, for all that you've done for this important cause.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Well said.
Yes, we owe a great deal of gratitude to Elaine, you as well, and the members of the Tuckahoe History Committee for helping in the research that led to the Ward House nomination, and we look forward to working together on future projects. The Ward House is a big one, to be continued on April 14th, which is our next Historic Preservation Commission meeting, unless there are any last attempts to add a discussion. Let me then bring tonight's meeting to a close. I will thank my fellow members of the commission, the members of the public, for your thoughtful input, and we look forward to the next meeting on April 14th here at Village Hall at 7 p.m. So until then, thank you. The meeting is adjourned.